Whenever people ask me what I do for work, I always tell them I have the best job in the world. Aside from the privilege of making this podcast, I get to wake up every day and go to work at Weimar Academy. Weimar Academy is a high school located in the foothills of the Sierra Mountains of Northern California. Why is it the best job? Not just because few things are more important than working with young minds and leading them to Jesus, but because the young people there, the students, they're awesome. I firmly believe they're going to change the world, and if you're of the high school age, or you have kids or relatives that are, I want you to consider sending them to Weimar Academy too. At Weimar Academy, our goal is singular. We want to do everything possible to make sure these students meet Jesus. And you can meet him too, maybe even in one of my Bible classes. If you'd like to come and visit and check it out for yourself, visit weimaracademy.org.
And I thought to myself, my life's not normal anymore. My parents, they come home and they garden. They go for walks together. They read books. And when I was young, I was a bookworm. And I had come to a point where I couldn't do any of those things. My life existed like the only place I could be is in a club with the music playing, and we're out and we're having, we're clubbing, dancing. And as soon as I left that place, I would just feel an emptiness in my life, a void. And nothing could fill that void. And I chased after everything that was available pleasure-wise. And so that's kind of when I started to realize that, wow, life is really, really meaningless. What am I living for?
I'm Dean Cullinane, and you're listening to Why They Did That, a show that explores the motivations of biblical characters and how their choices can guide yours. Today's guest is a truly fascinating character. Calvin Kim is a dentist from Olympia, Washington. He's the co-founder of Army Bible Camp and the F5 Challenge, and he currently serves as the VP of Evangelism for ASI, one of the largest evangelism-focused institutions in the world. His passion for fitness and health is second only to his greatest passion, giving Bible studies and winning souls into God's kingdom. And something tells me that his participation in this episode might just increase the population of God's kingdom ever so slightly. It was only a few episodes ago that we stepped into the shoes of a young King Solomon, the vibrant king of Israel, and the wisest man to have ever lived bar one. But oh, how much can change over the course of a single lifetime. No longer are we met with that youthful vibrance of he who sang the Song of Songs. Ages ago, it seems, the Queen of Sheba walked those shores, brought to her knees at the sight of the majesty of the God of Israel's kingdom. Now we turn the dark pages of the book of Ecclesiastes. Solomon has lived a life, to say the least. And as he approaches his last days, he looks back, pen in hand, and reflects on a life spent chasing the wind.
I love that in this book, that he's asking the kind of questions that all of us ask from time to time. Like, is it possible to have a meaningful life without purpose in this world? And so I just love how he unpacks it and he shares it. And the thing is, I can relate to him, not in any way by wealth, because none of us can, or in the way of wisdom, but I can relate, and it's because I had an insatiable and reckless thirst for pleasure. And here you can see that wisdom doesn't make you immune to the follies of sin.
Right.
As we see, because here when he starts out in his life, he was so faithful, walking in God's way. And then here we see where his life goes in a complete different trajectory.
Yeah, it's interesting because he gets to live the life that everyone wants to live. You know, the desire of the flesh
Yeah.
is he gets to do the whole thing. And when you know, I think both of us have had our experiences away from Christianity, and you look at his story and you think, well, that's what I want.
Yep.
I want the money and I want the wisdom. I want to be venerated and for people to see me as this exalted figure. I want to achieve all of these things. And I think the idea there is that once I have it all, I'll come to a place in my life where I'll look back and just be like, oh, this has been amazing. This is everything that anyone could ever want. And Solomon has the polar opposite experience. He looks back, and in looking back, the one word that comes to his mind is the Hebrew word is just breath. There's nothing to it. Like it's meaningless. I had all of it without the Lord. It's vanity.
Here, we see in 1 Kings chapter 2, we see his father, David. For so much of his life, he was such a winner, but he had some major fails in his life. And you live with those regrets. And I'm so thankful that God forgives us and cleanses us, and in him we can have a new life. But still, there's some things I can't erase. There are some consequences from my actions that have hurt people dearly. And so here, David, because of his experience, he wants to caution his son. And so here we see him sharing this with his son, because he knows that the only way that his son is going to be successful as a king is that he will be faithful to God and walk in his statutes and his commandments. A wise and successful person was once asked, what is the key to your success? And this person said, good judgment. They asked him, where would you get good judgment from? And he said, experience. And where do you get experience? And his reply was, poor judgment. Since my conversion when I was about 27, and it makes sense because, studies show that your frontal lobe for most of us does not mature until you're 25, but even until the age of 30. And so finally at about 27, I think my frontal lobe finally matured, and that's when I had my conversion. And since then, my life has been a blessing, and I attribute that to making good choices. And that's because I made plenty of bad choices in my life. I've made so many that I'm very careful now. And so I've learned from my own experience.
Yeah. So when it comes to having the opportunity to do whatever you want, and we find this so often with the young, impressionable minds. Why do you think it is, other than, the brain's not just fully developed yet, what do you think is the lure? Like, what is it that pulls us so much into a lifestyle that is usually contrary to God's will for us?
Two things come to my mind. One is sin is fun. If it wasn't fun, everybody wouldn't be doing it. And then the Bible tells us why people engage in sin. Because the results of sin is not executed until much later, right? If you smoked cigarettes and you got lung cancer the next day, no one will be smoking cigarettes.
Right.
But the effects of the cigarette smoking and the lung cancer doesn't come until 30 years later. And so even in my own life, when I was living in the height of sin, it was euphoric. It was so euphoric that I thought, you know what, even if I had grown up in the church and I knew Bible prophecy and I knew doctrines, and for me, I never doubted the existence of God. I didn't have bad experiences in the church. I knew God was real. I knew he existed. But I thought that if life could be this exhilarating and this euphoric, I'd be willing to trade in my eternal destiny for what this world has to offer. So I was deceived in one way. I was completely deceived. The other thing about the difference, there's a book called The Teenage Brain written by a neuroscientist. And the main difference between adults and young people, adolescents, including young adults, until your frontal lobe matures, the one main difference is consequences. See, as adults, when we think about an idea or a plan, or our kids are going to do something, the first thing we think about is consequences. What's going to happen? But see, when you're young, we don't process consequences, which really explains a lot of the dumb things that my friends and I did when we were in high school. And I look back and I'm like, well, what were we thinking? We weren't. We were just thinking in the moment about the fun that we're going to have. I remember, my routine would be like get up in the morning, have a cup of coffee, driving to work, smoking a cigarette, and think, wow, life is grand. I'm going to ride this thing out. And the thing is that initially sin is fun, but the Bible tells us that, speaking of Moses, that he chose one direction over the pleasures of sin for a season. That tells us sin only is fun for a season. That's not very long. And so, when you're in that season, you think you're invincible. I was young. I was finishing dental school. I'm going to be making more money than I've ever made in my life. I had my health, and all I could think about was having a grand time with my friends,
Mm.
going out. And so at that time, I'm not thinking about anything else but serving myself. When I look at King Solomon's life, initially, when God tells him, I'll give you anything that you want, and he wants a heart of understanding
Mm.
so that he can judge his people. So his focus is on other people, right? And you see such a humble attitude.
Yeah.
And when you contrast that with his life later on, what is his life all about? It's focused on himself. The focus is only on himself, and that humility is completely gone. It was imperceptible. It happens so slowly. They say, how do you eat an elephant? The answer is one bite at a time. When we say someone fell into adultery, you don't really fall into adultery. It actually started from other things way before that time. Maybe it was pornography. Maybe it was not controlling your lustful thoughts. Maybe not spending your time with the Lord. But no one just falls into sin. It starts slowly.
And so it was with Solomon. It starts slowly. I mean, you don't just end up married to hundreds of women. He seems to have some sort of insatiable appetite for lust. Lust for women, for power, for political influence. But let's step down from our high horses for a second. His experience speaks to the entirety of the human experience, the desire that we all have for whatever passions and vices we are tempted with. The reality is that were we to let go of our hold on the Lord, were we to send him away so that we could live a life chasing the wind, we too would fill our cup to the brim with 1,000 evils.
I can relate to that because I discovered from my own experience. We were literally going clubbing 3 to 6 nights in a row. The most I ever clubbed was 21 nights in a row. One time I was in 3 different clubs in one night. I mean, most people, you go to a club. I mean, we start at 10 o'clock, 12 o'clock, we're in a different club. And then a lot of clubs end at 1 or 2. Now we're going to another club that's open till later.
Mm.
And I discovered from my own experience that sin cannot be satisfied. It goes for greed. It goes for addiction. No one quits at a certain, I've got plenty. I'm satisfied and content. And so, Andrew Carnegie, who is one of the most wealthiest men, when they asked him, how much more money would you need? At that time, he had so much wealth, and he goes, just a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that we can learn from King Solomon's experience is that if one woman cannot satisfy you, 1,000 women cannot satisfy you. Sin is insatiable. There's no satisfaction. And the thing is, in my life, initially, it was all, it was bliss.
Mm.
It was fun, pleasure, seeking after that. But eventually, it catches up, and all of a sudden, it's no longer satisfying.
Mm-hmm.
I remember being in a bus in Korea. I'd go to Korea to party. And I was sitting in that bus, and this is years after I'd been engaging in this kind of lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought to myself, my life's not normal anymore. My parents, they come home and they garden. They go for walks together. They read books. And when I was young, I was a bookworm. And I had come to a point where I couldn't do any of those things. My life existed like the only place I could be is in a club with the music playing, and we're out and we're having, we're clubbing, dancing. And as soon as I left that place, I would just feel an emptiness in my life, a void.
Mm.
And nothing could fill that void. And I chased after everything that was available pleasure-wise. And so that's kind of when I started to realize that, wow, life is really, really meaningless. What am I living for? But I'm looking back, I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful, I wonder, how come Satan doesn't make it so that the pleasure lasts forever?
Mm.
He'd probably have greater success. But I'm so glad that I fell into that emptiness and hit rock bottom, because that's when I realized I need something more in my life.
Right. And I think that's the same conclusion that Solomon comes to himself. You look in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, and he's talking about how, he had all the money, and he had the vineyards, and he had the orchards, and he had the fruit, and he had the gold and the silver and everything that you could possibly want. He says, whatever mine eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I withheld not my heart from any joy. All of these things I had. And then he says, I looked on all the works that my hands had wrought, and on the labor that I had labored to do, and behold, everything was vanity, and there was nothing new under the sun.
Yep.
And it's almost as if, because you hear that phrase a lot, nothing new under the sun. I think it's probably the least believed phrase in scripture, that there's nothing new, because we always fall for the same deception, that it can be different for us, that our experience can testify that no, actually I found new things. I found pleasure away from the Lord, and it was lasting.
Yeah.
And I think, well, go and read the guy that had all the pleasure in the world and see what he had to say. He says nothing. It was nothing new. It was all vanity.
With King Solomon, in that same way, he thought he would also be the exception,
Mm-hmm.
that he could maybe engage in relationships outside of God's defined prescription.
Right.
And so he thinks that he's the exception, that, I won't fall into this. In so many ways, and it's relatable. Like, for example, we all grow up hearing that money doesn't make us happy.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe subconsciously we realize that money, we see examples and, we see all the Hollywood stars. Money doesn't make us happy. And studies show that money doesn't make us happy. Studies actually show that as long as your basic needs are met, food and shelter, beyond making $70,000, beyond that, you can make $2 million, $10 million, will not affect your happiness. Doesn't make you any happier.
Mm-hmm.
And if you hang out with any people who've got money, most of them are some of the most miserable people in the world. But we still want to find out for ourselves, don't we?
Yeah.
Especially when you look at college students, and I remember when I was growing up as an immigrant kid, I only had one goal in my mind. My goal was I want to get out, get a career, and start making money.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's something about us that we kind of want to find out for ourselves, even though we're told this. And that's the difference, I think, is I'm 48. I'm going to turn 49 in a couple of weeks now. I'm getting close to 50. And, one of the things I realize as I get older and older is like all those proverbs, all those maxims, all those things that we heard that were so cliche. And you realize there's a reason they're all there, because they're all true.
Perhaps the greatest example of pride is to think that one can walk in the way of righteousness without the help of the Lord. That we can just live it up, but we'll never go that far. We'll never stray to the point that we ourselves cannot return. We'll loosen our grip, but we'll never actually let go. Satan believed the same thing, that he could be like the Most High, even after turning his back on him. Chances are, you're not the exception. Solomon spends his life chasing the wind and arrives at the supposed peak of the mountain of life empty-handed. These things were written as an example for us. Stop chasing the wind, people. Stop striving for that which will fade, that which will burn in the end. As he said at the end of the book himself, he who lived such a life, if you're going to do anything, fear God and keep his commandments, for that is the whole duty of man. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. I'm Dean Cullinane, and you're listening to Why They Did That. So throughout this season, we've been hammering on about this new app called Luminate, and we're going to unashamedly do it again. This morning, I was out having my morning walk. It's California summer, so it's still like 85-degree heat at 7:30 a.m., and it was as if I was transported to another realm. I had my earphones in, and I was listening to our mutual friend, Callie Burachara, take me through the first 3 chapters of one of my favorite books, Steps to Christ. I finished that hour walk with a heart that was both elevated and accelerated, and I can't recommend it enough. Go to your app store and search Luminate World and download it now for free. The Lineage Journey series on YouTube is some of the best content on that platform, period. 5-minute episodes that take you throughout the entire history of the Christian movement. Where else can you get that? They've even got a brand new 42 episode series that is being released right now. But what if you want more depth? Something longer, something you can really sink your teeth into? Well, they've got you covered on that one too with the Lineage Journey podcast, where in each episode they've got certified experts on to take you through all of the details of the whys and the hows of Christian history. They've got close to 15 episodes out now with another 15 on the way. So why not subscribe to them too and check out their stuff? Remember, history shapes identity, and the content you consume shapes you. Check it out. Solomon's Journey isn't merely a lesson on vanity, it's a thesis on the very purpose of life itself. Here we are, surrounded by everything we could possibly want and more. We live in a time of plenty, and yet all we seem to want is more. More money, more pleasure, more fame, more. Ecclesiastes has been given to us to say, hold up, there's something more than the material world. There's something more than your hedonistic appetites. There's purpose, genuine purpose for life. And that purpose, that's something that we dare not ever let go of.
Here's a guy, he started his life off understanding his purpose. His purpose in life. I mean, Israel, God had set up this kingdom to be a blessing to the world. And when you look at his interaction with the Queen of Ethiopia, I mean, what a blessing. I mean, just think of what a legacy it could have been, to be a light. The parable of the fig tree comes to my mind. Here, the owner plants a fig tree in a vineyard, which is kind of odd initially, right? Why would you put a fig tree? That doesn't belong in a vineyard. But that fig tree represents Israel. And it kind of goes back, there's a method of Bible interpretation called the law of first mention. Where do you first see a fig tree? And you first see it in the Garden of Eden. And what did they do with the fig leaves? They covered themselves. And linen's supposed to be representing the righteousness of the saints. We cover ourselves with Christ's righteousness. That's what Revelation tells us. And yet they cover themselves. And so it represents self-righteousness. And throughout in the New Testament, when you see Jesus mention fig tree, actually through the whole Bible, the fig tree represents the children of Israel. And theirs was to be planted in the vineyard, and the vineyard represents the world in Jesus' parable when he sent his sons out to go work in the vineyard. And here they're to bear fruit. And contextually in that story, they're to bear fruits of repentance. But not just bear fruits of repentance, they're to bear fruits that will be a light to the world. And here we know what happened, and they failed to do that. And we see probation closes in that story, right? It's like, cut that tree down. And so this is all that Solomon could have had. And he knew what his purpose was. And as he was fulfilling his purpose, you see God's heart. God just wants to bless him. And you see his kingdom, his growing in wealth, his influence, and the people. They respected their king. What a blessing. And then you see how tyrannical he becomes as he loses that purpose and focus in his life. And when you lose that focus, there's only one focus. It's just me, myself, and I. And we live in that kind of a society today. All around us, one of my Bible study contacts, we're studying something, and he was sharing how, he was this is something that the world espouses. Well, you can't love somebody else unless you love yourself. And it sounds good on the surface, doesn't it? Well, how can you love somebody unless you really love yourself? But the Bible doesn't teach anything about loving yourself. What the Bible tells us, it says you need to love others like you love yourself, because we already love ourselves. That's not the problem. You don't need to love this whole self-esteem movement. Well, you have these issues because your self-esteem is low. No, our self-esteem is pretty actually high. We actually naturally are, self-centered. It comes naturally. The Bible tells us in 2 Timothy 3, and describing the end times, and perilous times will come, and men will be what? Lovers of themselves. But here, what the world espouses creeps in, and it sounds normal and it sounds mainstream. But what does Jesus tell us to do? The first and second great commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your fellow man as yourself. And, from my own experience, when I was living that life, all I could think about was pleasing myself. It didn't matter if I was trampling on people, hurting people's hearts. doing things, looking back, I'm like, wow, I've become so immoral. I grew up in a Christian home. There's things that I would never have done. And yet, I just lost all of the principles and morals that I had grown up with. And it didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly. It just got eroded. When I first started, how it started is I was in dental school. It was my second year. And sure, in college, I'd experimented a little bit with alcohol and weed and things like that. But for the most part, I kind of stayed away from a lot of that. I was focused on getting to dental school. And I was studying hard. My spiritual life was good. And in my second year of dental school, swing dancing had become this new fad.
Hmm.
Gap, the clothing company, had put out a commercial called Gap Swing. And these guys are wearing Gap clothes and they're swing dancing. And this commercial became just a popular thing. And all of a sudden, this 1930s iconic dance that people used to do years ago became this new thing. And so I was invited to go to a swing club. And I went there and I was watching them. And, unless you know what you're doing, it's no fun. If you're a girl, you don't know how to dance, a guy can take you and show you basic steps. And I just kind of watched and I thought, when you don't know how to do something, you think, this is dumb. This is so dumb. I thought I'd never come back here again. Somehow, I don't know what happened. I ended up back at that club 2-3 weeks later. Now, keep in mind, this is not like going to some, crazy club.
It's not a rave.
It's not a rave or anything like that. This is like swing music. This is like 1930s music, and a lot of people dress up like 1930s wear.
There's nothing new under the sun.
There's nothing new under the sun. Exactly. And so I was watching this, and I was like, I need to learn how to do this. So I took one lesson, and it just clicked. You learn just the basic footwork, and it totally makes sense. And it was so much fun. Next thing you know, we're driving out to LA, an hour away from Loma Linda, anywhere from 3 to 6 nights a week. And soon, hanging out with this in a crowd, eventually, soon I pick up smoking, and then pick up drinking, things like that. And then eventually, now it's all kinds of dancing. And eventually now I'm going to the rave scene, and now I'm experimenting with drugs.
It's funny how you can have these like really strong, high moralistic positions, where you can look, you kind of peer into your prospective future and say, well, I'm never going to do that.
Right.
That's never going to be me. For me, it was the smoking thing. I never actually did, but I would see my mom was a big smoker, and I would be like, I'm never going to do that. And then I remember my younger brother coming to me and saying, Dean, why does mommy do that? And I was like, well, she's been doing it since she was 13 years old. She's just addicted to it. And he's like, but it smells really bad. He's 6 years young. And I was like, yeah, I know. And he's like, I'm never going to do that. That's horrible. And I was like, good, good. He smokes more than she does now. I remember my cousin, same conversation. His mom didn't smoke, but my mom would always be at his house. And he was like, man, your mom's disgusting. She's always smoking and it stinks and it makes our clothes stink and the house stink. I felt embarrassed. I was like, yeah, yeah. And he's like, I'm never going to do that. He smokes more than her now. And I had, growing up, it was just my mom, my brother in the home. She instilled in me these values, in terms of how you treat people and the things that you should get involved in and the things that you shouldn't. And for me, I was like, well, drugs and alcohol, because I wanted to be an athlete.
Yeah.
Drugs and alcohol, where I was going to draw the line. And then all my friends were getting involved in that stuff. And before I knew it, I had drugs in my house. I wasn't using them, but I was selling them, and I was trying to make money to get the latest things when I grew up knowing that really wasn't the most important thing. And I think that's one of those the pitfalls of sin, that you can get to the place where you think it's never going to be you until it is.
Yep.
And then you're there and you're like, how? And you don't notice like this giant step that you took to become like that, because you just slowly allowed the devil to break you down bit by bit until that line that you would never cross was already way behind you.
Absolutely. And one thing I want to add to what you just said is that temptation, and you see this in the Bible, temptation often comes from an avenue we least expect. For example, you look at Jacob, the temptation came from his own mother to deceive his father. And you look at other stories, and temptation often comes to us from those closest to us. Not from, you think, be careful of the bad guy down the street, the guy who's dealing crack.
Right.
Well, you're not hanging out with that guy.
Yeah.
Be careful of those evil people. Be careful of the mafia. We don't even hang out with gangbang. We don't meet these people.
Yeah.
But it's really, the temptation comes from those closest around us. For me, It was my classmates who invited me out there to something innocuous. But eventually, that's all Satan needs, you know? You give him an inch, he'll take a mile.
Yeah. And it's interesting that with Solomon, um, this doesn't this doesn't happen in his youth. You know, this isn't as we see, he becomes king really young when his dad passes away, and there's a period of time, arguably, where Israel is at its absolute peak because of his rulership in his youth. And it seems like he's got everything lined up. You know, he's the culmination of many of these prophecies that were given, you know, that you would bless the whole world, that God would bless you to bless the world. And that's what Israel has now with Solomon as its young king. His fall actually comes later in life.
I read that he had become king when he was 15 years old. You
Mm,
think about that. When I was 15, boy, I was immature.
yeah.
And, you know, oftentimes we caution the youth. We caution the youth. But here is a prime example of someone not in his youth, he was faithful,
Mm,
but it's in his latter years. And even when I look around and we see some of our esteemed speakers and those who may have a moral fall, we often see this happening later on in life.
mm,
There's a proverb that comes to my mind. It's a Korean saying. Basically, I'm going to try to translate the best I can. But, you know, like gallivanting and, you know, being reckless later in life is much more dangerous
mm.
than earlier on in life. Now, of course, we don't want to do that earlier or later on in
Right.
life. But, you know, when you do that earlier in life, like I did, there were consequences, but those consequences are not as big
Mm,
because, you know, I'm not married. I don't have kids. But when you do these things later on in life, the consequences are huge. You wreck other people's lives. And in his case, wow, he had so much influence over an entire kingdom. And then he becomes oppressive to his people as a result. You know, his compassion and his love for his people are not there anymore. And so we see what happens to his kingdom.
Why do you think it is that um, that those falls tend to come later? Because as you've said, when you're young, brain's not fully working, and the consequences aren't even that great. So if there's any time, it's probably then. You've got excuses and a lack of serious consequences. When you're older, you've had experiences, you're able to think about things properly, you know the
Right.
consequences are greater, but yet that's when it seems to tumble down, just as it did in his case.
You know, that's a good question. I only have a theory for that. You know, I often think, you know, we'll see, for example, let's just say, for an example, you have some girl meets boy, they're high school sweethearts. They get married. 10 years later, the husband or wife is dissatisfied with their relationship. And they think in their mind that, you know, find someone better that would
Mm,
solve all their problems. And you and I know that all you do is you trade one set of problems for a whole nother set of problems. But, you know, because they've never had this experience, and I don't know why it is that, and I speak for myself, I was one of these people, I always learn from my own mistakes. You know, the wise person will learn from someone else's mistakes.
right.
You'll see it. We see it all around us. And there's something about this. And so, yeah. So, you know, Satan's powerful. He knows how to deceive and delude us into thinking that the grass is greener on the side. And that's a hard one for me to understand because for me, because of my poor choices and because of the experience that I had, you know, you play with fire, you get burned.
Mm,
And you know what? Sure, you heal, but the scar shall always be there. And there are things that I have to live with. When I share my testimony, I always caution the young people. When I share the whole testimony, you know, and I know what it's like for a young person, they hear the story and they go, you know what? I want to have that kind of testimony. I want to have that kind of experience. And then, you know, I can experience the world and then I'll come back. And I always want to caution the youth that there are serious consequences. There are things that I had to overcome that they will never have to overcome.
mm,
You know, imagine if you've never tried, uh, a certain drug, it would never be a temptation for you. You don't know it. But once you do, and there's just certain things that you're going to have to battle. And there are certain things that I had to work very hard, and only by God's grace was I able to overcome these things. But the thing is, for everyone who overcomes, I look around my friends, and there's a lot of people who never make it back.
right.
And so it's something you don't ever want to trifle with. You do not want to trifle with sin. You know, from my firsthand experience, I've discovered sin not only hurts me, it hurts the heart of God.
Mm,
It hurts his children. It hurts others. Sin has built-in consequences. And the Bible tells us the wages of sin is death. You know, to understand that what the cost that it took. That, we hear this so much that Jesus died for our sins. I totally understand. It kind of becomes trite and it loses its meaning. But, as I am growing in my walk with the Lord, and I realize that this gift that God gave is beyond computation. It's inestimable. It could not have been said that he could have done more. There's nothing more he could have done. He gave all of heaven to save you and I. And, when I think about that, I just imagine, when I see God, when I see Jesus, what's it going to be like that moment we see Jesus? When I think about it, the only thing I can imagine, I think for most of us, we're going to stand there, and when we fully recognize the price that was paid, we will have no words. We'll just have tears streaming down our eyes. That's the only thing.
There's a quote I love that says, "There is no limit to the usefulness of the one who, putting self aside, makes room for the working of the Holy Spirit upon his heart and lives a life wholly consecrated to God." But the opposite of it must also be true. There is no limit to the wickedness of one who, putting self center stage, makes concession for sin and lust in his heart and lives a life wholly consecrated to the enemy. Ecclesiastes is one of those books that you have to read to the end. Otherwise, you'll leave depressed. You'll leave thinking that there's no purpose to anything, that life, regardless of how it's lived, is simply spent chasing the wind, meaningless, vanity. But when we get to the end of the book, we find a man once lost in wickedness who looks back and says, yes, it was all a colossal waste of time. But now, if there's one thing I know, it's this: life is best lived with the Lord.
That's why I think his perspective is so important, is because he explored and he experienced every depth of human experience. The highs, the lows, the sorrows, the pain, the trials. See, what I see here in life is most people don't experience all this. So they keep thinking that there's something out there. I'll give you an example. I have a cousin who's agnostic, and he grew up and he hadn't seen his father since he was a young boy. He's searching for happiness, and he wants to meet his father. And I see that. What I see is he thinks that the reason why the woes and the lack of happiness in his life is because he's never had a connection with his earthly father. And he thinks, as soon as I meet my father, that's gonna be it.
Right.
Well, in his later age as an adult, he was able to meet his father. His problems are still there. You see that on talk show hosts, right? Someone just wants to meet their baby daughter that they gave away for adoption, or their long lost somebody, or they just think, if I just make enough money, if I marry the person that I love, all my problems will solve. And so they just keep chasing after these things. Whereas in Solomon's case and in my case, I chased after everything that I thought would bring me happiness. I was in a pursuit for one thing: pleasure and happiness. And nothing that came my way. And that's where I can relate with Solomon, is that anything that I wanted, I sought after. And in no way the way that Solomon did, of course, you know what I mean? But everything that I desired, and I chased after every vice that came my way. And here at the end of his life, he makes a complete U-turn. At the beginning of the book, this book, Ecclesiastes, is like an essay on apologetics, but not in the traditional sense of, does God really exist, or there isn't a God? It's different, because he begins by writing from the perspective of someone who writes as if God doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter. And here at the end of his life, he makes a U-turn. And his perspective is that God does matter. And we see that. And how does he say this? He tells us, for God shall bring every work into judgment, with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. Here he's telling us that every single thing does matter, and that a life with God does matter. In my own personal life, someone just recently asked me, they said they'd heard my testimony being shared by my best friend. I'll actually share with you what happened, how I had the conversion. I'd invited my best friend to come to Seattle to go to a rape with me. Now, my best friend at that time is 32 years old. He's a prosecuting attorney. You prosecute people who are breaking the law. But when you're yourself living an empty life, you're grasping after pleasure. And so he took me up on my offer, came up to Seattle, took him to a rave, put him gave him ecstasy. It was his first time, and we're in a rave. And in a rave, I'm in my thing. I'm high on ecstasy. I'm dancing, having a great time. And it was at that rave that God spoke to him.
Wow.
And I see him at about 4 in the morning. And he goes, Calvin, I've given my life to the Lord. It was very sobering. You can imagine. And I'm thinking at that moment, this is not the time. I'm high on ecstasy. I'm having a good time. Like, you're killing my high. But God had spoken to him in a very real way. He was sick and tired of 1 foot in the church, 1 foot in the world, just grasping for happiness. Anyways, that was a defining moment in his life. His life completely changed. When he went back home, he quit his job for 1 year to go be a missionary in the islands. And when he came back, he still felt that, what? Do I want to spend the rest of my life prosecuting people and putting them into prison? And so he actually quit his job and went to AFCO for the 4-month program, and afterwards, because he was already a prosecuting attorney, so he's good at standing in front of people and speaking, so they picked him up as an evangelist for 10 years. And, it was right after that rave incident that Dave was pleading with me to give my life to the Lord. And at that time, I had fallen so far away, but I was so sick and tired of the darkness. And so it was just a miracle that God could, if he can part the waters, he can part that fog in our brain of being intoxicated and incoherent and speak. And through Dave ministered to me. And that's when I had given my life to the Lord.
So how exactly did that happen?
Oh, he would call me and he'd say, Calvin, you need to give your life to the Lord. And I said, Dave, I know you're right. I can't. And then all of a sudden, just not very long after that, I went through a trial where I really hurt somebody big time. And I thought, what am I doing? And that night, I just cried out to the Lord. I said, Lord, I'm tired of this. I just want to give my life back to you. And one of the things I could not quit smoking. I tried quitting smoking. I was smoking a pack a day. And instantly that night, that next day, I never had a craving again. So that was just, and it was this miracle that I needed. And so I began my journey, and I was just hungering and thirsting for anything spiritual. I just wanted to meet people who are studying the Bible. I want to meet with them. I was reading my Bible, and just, that next 6 months was a real spiritual high. But after that, and then I went through my trials and struggles too, because, Satan pounds you with guilt and just all the different things like, man, you did this, you hurt these people, you did all these things. But I'm blessed that at that time, my parents had moved up to where I was. So I had my parents. I had good support. I had a good church. Without those things, it would have been easy to just kind of slip back into the world. But, God blessed. And that was 20 years ago. And, looking back, I can attest to the superiority of the Christian life. I've been in darkness. I see light.
He that hath an ear, let him hear. And you've just heard our latest show. If you'd like to hear more or harken back to a previous episode, you can find us now at wtdtpodcast.com. If you've been moved by this ministry through this episode or others, and you'd like to support us financially, you can become a patron. And if you do, you'll get early access to our episodes, discounts on our store, and access to our other podcast, a 40-day devotional podcast designed to kickstart your walk with God. We're calling it WTDT 40. If this sounds like something you're interested in, or you just want to support in general, visit patreon.com/WTDT to find out more. As always, please do subscribe, leave us a review, and follow our social media accounts on Instagram, Facebook, and now TikTok too. We'll see you on the next episode. Once again, I'm Dean Cullinane, and you're listening to Why They Did That.